student loan assistance, reform welfare, continue funding for Head Start, and many, many more high priorities while balancing the budget and saving $160 billion in debt accumulation by 2002.
But the Democrats' plan was opposed by a majority from both parties.
I think it is seriously flawed. It spends more than $50 billion more on welfare over 5 years than the committee would propose to do. It also cuts defense spending by $55 billion below that is in the committee level. Now, I think all the members of this body who have been, certainly those that have been around here a few years or who have looked at budgets over the last several years, can see the decline that we have had in defense spending. And I think most of us recognize that there is a point below which you do not cut spending without significantly damaging the national security of this country.
Conservative Republicans also pushed a plan that would balance the budget by the year 2000, 2 years earlier than their leadership proposes.
Our plan begins to make the cuts in years 1 and 2 instead of years 6 and 7. Look at this chart. It explains it all. By making the same cuts early instead of late, we save $600 billion in deficits, including $42 billion in interest that we pay out to foreign countries that own our debt.
But that plan failed as well.
Now, I will probably not be voting for the substitute we're talking about now because I think it may be going a little bit too fast.
A third balanced budget alternative, sponsored by members of the Congressional Black Caucus, called for deeper cuts in defense spending and increases in corporate taxes.
The CBC budget closes the tax loopholes and giveaways from which the Rupert Murdochs of this country have benefited since the trickle-down years of the 1980s. Moreover, the CBC budget strengthens the programs which educate our children and heal our elderly.
That alternative also failed, clearing the way for a final vote on the House Republicans' plan to balance the budget by 2002. Budget Committee Chairman John Kasich, who designed the plan, closed the debate.
I want to say to my friends who may vote against this, we're going to do this now. We're going to bring the pendulum back, and we have our vision for emphasizing the individual. That doesn't mean the government does not have a role. It does. And I know how many of you have worked and bled and fought for the things that you believe in. And as we as Republicans begin to put this plan together, as we march down this road to saving America, I'm going to urge everybody to keep their minds and their ears and their eyes open about how we can do it right.
The outcome of the vote was certain. In the end, 8 Democrats joined all but 1 Republican in supporting the majority's plan.
The yeas are 238, the nays are 193. The concurrent resolution is adopted.
The House now will turn to specific spending or appropriation bills, and once approved, they'll have to be reconciled with the work of the Senate and signed by the President.
We go next to a favorite target of some budget balancers, foreign aid, which accounts for 1% of the federal budget. The Senate Budget Committee's proposal, for instance, would cut money from most international operations, including aid to Russia. The Russian issue was one of several Secretary of State Christopher spoke to today before a Senate Appropriations Subcommittee.
In short, I believe that our assistance has put America on the right side of the struggle for reform in Russia, and I know it's very tempting to end or curtail these programs as a way of punishing Russia when it does something that we oppose. And I certainly am all for maximizing our leverage. But I've gone back and I reviewed the assistance programs that we have, and I've concluded that cutting them back simply makes no sense. It would not serve the interests of the American people. We need to ask ourselves the very tough questions about this assistance to Russia. Should we stop funding necessary to dismantle the nuclear weapons that once targeted America's cities? Should we cut off support for privatization and free elections, wiping out programs that strengthen the very forces in Russia that share our interests and values, the very forces, indeed, that are the most critical of the Russian efforts in Chechnya? As you know, it's my preference to speak with a certain degree of diplomatic discretion. But in this case, I feel it absolutely necessary to be blunt about the matter. The cuts contained in the budget resolutions would damage our nation's interests and cripple our ability. They are irresponsible. And I will continue to oppose them as strongly as I possibly can. Mr. Chairman and members, I simply am convinced that we cannot support our nation's foreign policy on the cheap. We cannot protect our interests as the world's most powerful nation if we do not marshal the resources to stand by our commitments. We cannot lead if we are deprived of the tools of leadership. We cannot have it both ways.
Now, two views from that subcommittee, those of its chairman, Senator Mitch McConnell, Republican of Kentucky, and the ranking Democrat, Senator Patrick Leahy of Vermont. Senator McConnell, what do you make of Secretary Christopher's warning that cuts in the Senate budget resolution are irresponsible?
Well, actually, I largely agree with him, and I intend to offer an amendment to the budget resolution, which my good friend to my right here, Patrick Leahy, is going to support, which I hope will enjoy enough bipartisan support to increase the 150 account, which is the combination of the State Department and foreign assistance, to a more acceptable level than in the budget resolution, so that at the end of the 7-year period we'll still be able to do something overseas other than simply send in the troops.
So that's your reading of the budget resolution before the Senate now, that would balance the budget by 2000, and to make sure we understand what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
The Domenici resolution, the plan, would in fact do that? In other words, if that got enacted into law, that's about all that would be left for the United States?
Yeah, that's about all that would be left. I do have some differences with the Secretary, particularly at the end of his comments. He indicated he was not willing to come out in support of the amendment that I and others will be offering, which I found astonishing given the fact that it was in many respects consistent with his criticism of the budget. But in that respect, I think hopefully there will be a bipartisan consensus here in the Senate that the reduction in foreign aid envisioned by the Republican budget resolution really does go too far.
Have you said this to Senator Domenici and Senator Dole and your colleagues?
Oh, yeah.
And what do they say when you say that to them?
Well, I'm hoping, we're working on it now, but I'm hoping that we'll have some support. Obviously, anytime you offer an amendment to the budget resolution, there has to be an offset. Yeah. And everybody is somewhat apprehensive.
Meaning you got to raise, you got to come up with it. You got to either come up with another cut to match it or more money to match it, right?
Absolutely.
One way or another.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it will require senators to stand up and be counted on the question of foreign assistance. And as you can imagine, many people would prefer to hide under their desks when it comes to that kind of an issue.
I want to come back to that overall issue in a moment, but yes. Senator Leahy, what's the Democratic view of this dispute among the Republicans, for one thing?
Well, I would hope that the Democratic view would be the same as what Senator McConnell and I are both going to say, that we do have to increase this amount. Foreign policy should be, as Senator Vandenberg said decades ago, a case where partisanship ends at the water's edge. Think of what we're doing. This isn't a case where we're saying, look, let's just send a whole lot of American tax dollars into the pockets of foreigners. We're saying, how do we best protect our own interests? We are the wealthiest, most powerful nation on earth. We have won the Cold War. We now are in a position that every other country can look at us really with envy, but they also look at us with surprise because they see us backing off from international and worldwide obligations and opportunities. We're number, I think, 20 or 21 in the percentage of our budget that goes to foreign aid. Japan spends more actual dollars than we do because they know that they're creating markets for their manufacturers, they're creating jobs for their people in doing this.
Well, Senator, how do you respond to those who would say, wait a minute, you're going to cut the growth, not cut the program necessarily, but cut the rate of growth in Medicare and in Medicaid, in agriculture subsidies. The proposals are to cut back rates of growth and in some cases eliminate many domestic programs. Why in the world shouldn't foreign aid take its hit too?
Foreign aid has taken its hit. It's gone down more than just about any other part of our federal budget in the last 5 or 6 years. It's 30 or 40% less than it was just 6 or 7 years ago. But you can't just say that the United States, the most powerful nation on earth, is going to withdraw from the rest of the world. I'll give you just one example. Some of the things that we put into export programs. These create thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of jobs in the United States. That's what also pays for Medicare and pays for Social Security, nutrition programs, and everything else. You also have a case where what's going to happen if we disassociate ourselves from international peacekeeping organizations? Are we going to say instead, let's send American men and women in every time there's a conflagration?
Well, let me ask Senator McConnell. Yes,
Could I just add a point
Sure.
that hasn't been made yet either by Pat or myself, that your viewers should know? Foreign aid is less than 1% of the budget.
Right.
This amendment that I and Pat will be offering will deal with a very small percentage of 1%. The overall budget. So we're not talking about an issue here that would restore large amounts of money to a domestic program.
But to play devil's advocate with both of you, Senator McConnell, but isn't that the argument that everybody makes?
It is.
I mean, well, my little program here, my little program there, but everybody's little program adds up to one huge budget, doesn't it?
But Jim, let me point out what's different about defense and foreign policy.
How about?
Defense and foreign policy are the most important responsibilities of the federal government. Nobody else is involved in that. No state government, no local government. It is the exclusive domain of the federal government.
In other words, you can't block grant that one out.
You can't block grant foreign aid to Kentucky.
Okay, well, where then, Senator McConnell, does foreign aid and the things that you and Senator Leahy are talking about fit in to this push to balance the budget by the year 2002? Are you saying no hits at all?
No, we're not.
No, okay.
No, Pat and I may differ on this, but I think maybe we do. But I think we'll get some savings out of foreign aid reform. I support the bill that was reported out of the Foreign Relations Committee yesterday that would fold into the State Department AID, continue much of the...
That's the Agency for International Aid
Development,
program,
right. Continue to have that function, but carry it out in a consolidated way at less expense. So I do think that foreign aid will be cut further. The question is whether you're going to have enough left to do anything abroad 7 years from now other than send in the troops. And it's on that issue that I think Pat and I agree. I believe that foreign aid will be reduced. It'll be reduced even after my amendment if my amendment is adopted.
Yeah, I'll give you an example in this. And Mitch is right. Do we just get down to the point where the only thing we might do to show America's influence is send in the troops?
Is somebody really suggesting that?
Well, we spent billions of dollars in Somalia after everything fell apart. Had we shown some involvement in democracy building and in the development of a middle class and a free enterprise system in Somalia, it could well be argued that for a tiny fraction of what we ultimately spent in military, we could have avoided the whole thing. But you know, I don't mind cutting. During the years I was chairman of this committee, we cut more money out of foreign aid. I think they've been cut out in 10, 20 years prior to that. But you don't say to the United States, look, sorry about that, you have no way of carrying out foreign policy around the world. We can't do that when we're the most powerful nation and the largest economy in the world.
What about this issue not only of AID, but also folding in USIA and the Arms Control Agency into the State Department? Do you that comes out of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee? Do you support that?
I support it. It's very similar to a bill that I suggested back in December.
That would save money, right?
I believe it will save some money, which will help us, I believe, still reduce what's called the 150 account, that is the combination of state and foreign assistance, but not go along, I would argue, with this steep cut recommended by the Republican majority on the Budget Committee, which really would, as a practical matter, leave us no non-military option 7 years from now.
Senator Leahy, how do you feel about those three agencies going into the State Department?
I do not support it, especially for AID, because I think that what they do is so different than what the Department of State does. I think that we should change the Foreign Assistance Act, which was written back in the Cold War period, to be more up to date. I don't think that they should become part of the State Department, because I think you're mixing apples with oranges. But I think that it is a legitimate debate to have. I hope we will have a real debate on it, and I hope that the administration will become heavily engaged in that debate. I think it raises legitimate questions.
Senator, to both of you, beginning with you, Senator McConnell, on the question of foreign aid, And this rose today in your subcommittee hearing, in fact, because the issue of Russia and the sale of the nuclear equipment to Iran, and Secretary Christopher spoke to that. When it comes to the use or how you use foreign aid, how the United States should use foreign aid, should it be used as a tool to send, say, a country like Russia a message, hey, you're not doing what we want, we're going to withdraw some foreign aid, or threaten to do that? What's your feeling about that?
As someone who has consistently supported Russian aid and made it bipartisan, I must say I also believe that aid and interests should intersect. And I do believe that a country which constantly goes against our best interest might well forfeit assistance. I think that assistance and our foreign policy interests ought to intersect, and that's one of the reasons I would like to have AID dismantled as it's currently constituted and made specifically a part of the State Department foreign policy apparatus.
As an arm of foreign policy, you mean?
Absolutely.
I mean, as a tool.
Absolutely. And particularly in a time of even greater diminished resources, it seems to me it argues for targeting those resources that we have available directly to complement our foreign policy interests.
Could I make
Do you agree with that, Senator Leahy?
In large parts I do, but let's be sure on one thing. We're not going to suddenly walk away from Russia. It is in our national security interest, actually in our economic interest, for them to become a democracy and have a market economy. This is a country with thousands and thousands of nuclear warheads, and it is in our interest to see them improve. Having said that, there is no reason why we can't express displeasure with their activities through our foreign aid. We made this clear when humanitarian aid was sent to Chechnya. Both Senator McConnell and I insisted that we take some of the cost of that out of aid that would have normally gone to Russia, to make it very clear that was what they were doing was affecting them. Yeah. But we can't just become engaged one year, not the next year, back the next, and think that we're going to see the result in Russia that we want, that is of democracy and a market economy.
Senator McConnell, finally, the other big player on the Republican side in this whole debate, obviously, is the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Jesse Helms of North Carolina. It seems to outside observers that the two of you are on very different tracks in terms of what foreign aid should be used for, what should be cut, etc. Is that a good reading?
I think we're partially on different tracks. He doesn't support foreign aid at all.
Yeah, well, that
I do. I think it is a useful tool of American foreign policy. I happen to share, however, his view that the reform proposal that came out of the Foreign Relations Committee yesterday would be a useful reform. So in that sense, we're in agreement. In the end, he would prefer not to have foreign assistance at all. I think it's important to have that tool.
Are you winning, or is he winning?
Well, on the budget, we'll find out next week.
Okay, all right. Thank you both, senators, very much.
Thank you.
Still ahead, Oregon reaction to sexual charges against Senator Packwood, seniors on the internet, and an Egyptian tomb rediscovered. Now the ethics case against a U.S. senator. Yesterday, after a 2.5-year investigation, the Senate Ethics Committee found there was substantial evidence that Senator Bob Packwood, Republican of Oregon, may have abused his office. The committee's report included 18 charges of sexual misconduct, an allegation that the senator tampered with evidence in the investigation, and that he solicited lobbyists to employ his former wife. Correspondent Lee Hochberg of Oregon Public Broadcasting reports on the reaction in Packwood's home state.
In Portland, women who say Packwood sexually harassed them immediately held a news conference to express their jubilation over the Ethics Committee findings.
There was a great chance that this was going to be swept under the rug. And probably what is most profound for me out of this is how significant the evidence had to be and how egregious his behaviors had to be for the Ethics Committee to come out at this juncture.
That has been difficult to hear, that the efforts that we have put forward, the courage that it's taken to speak out about this would be for naught, and that this man would walk and nothing would happen to him. That's been difficult. This action now is, as I said before, is affirming to me that, wait a minute, maybe that won't happen.
Portland attorney Carlton Grew started an anti-Packwood group in 1993. Yesterday, he demanded the ouster of the 5-term senator.
No other person in this country who committed this kind of activity in their job, besides a U.S. senator or a high public official, I don't think there'd be any question that that person would be fired. And that's basically what we are asking, that Senator Packwood be fired.
For the embattled Packwood, yesterday's announcement is a continuation of the political struggle he's had in his home state since the allegations became public in December of 1992.
I'm not going to get into the specifics of each and every charge. I'm simply going to say my conduct was wrong.
Many Oregonians who thought Packwood stood for enlightened attitudes toward women were enraged when he apologized for his behavior but refused to tell what he did or why he did it. Protesters hounded him, and his visits to Oregon became rare.
I'm not going to meet with people who go out and say, resign now, Packwood, we hate you. They've already judged this. They've already made a decision. What's the point in my meeting with them?
Today, nearly half of Oregonians want the once popular senator to resign his office, according to a poll in the Portland Oregonian. But a group of 35 prominent Republicans, called Oregonians for a Fair Hearing, insists Packwood isn't getting a fair shake. Attorney Jeanette Slepian.
He has an impeccable record in terms of what he has done for women as a whole and the individual women that have served on his staff. And you can count the hundreds of women that have served on his staff who credit their careers to his launching them, him giving them the confidence that they can succeed both in government as well as the private sector.
Slepian says even if the 18 charges listed by the Ethics Committee are true, Packwood shouldn't be judged on them.
They don't rise to the level of sexual harassment. They don't rise to the level, to me, of anything other than boorish, inappropriate behavior. And if it's inappropriate behavior that's embarrassing to the Senate, then let them censor him in whatever the appropriate manner is. But, you know, certainly I think his record of what he has done for women certainly outweighs, you know, anything that's contained in this.
In rural Oregon, farmers remain fond of Packwood because of his conservative philosophy on land use. 59 female members of the Oregon Farm Bureau drafted this letter in his defense 2 years ago. These two farmers say his power as a senior member of the Senate and chairman of the Senate Finance Committee is reason to keep him in office.
The issues of his charges or his allegations have nothing to do with how he's working for us. I mean, he stands behind our private property rights and the Endangered Species Act. He knows how that affects us as farmers and business people.
But Packwood's alleged victims say it's time to act swiftly against the senator. Former employee Mary Heffernan testified that Packwood grabbed her and tried to kiss her one day at work. She's prepared to repeat her allegations in public hearings, though she fears taking on the senator face-to-face could mean more heat for her.
I will go and be as honest as I possibly can with as much integrity as possible. And that doesn't mean I will be treated well or that it won't be a hurtful process. There's certainly the potential there of it being a very hurtful process.
It's important to me that I be heard. It's important to me that I be able to say to my daughters, I did this. I took care of myself here.